measuring the adequacy based on outcomes as opposed to prescribed inputs. You know, that whole model change of, okay, well, how do we measure it, and how does the state support it? And then the other part is, okay, well, how do we fund it? You know, because it's, looking at the outcomes is a much different way than the state has always looked at outcomes, but not as part necessarily of the adequacy formula. So it should be interesting to see how this whole thing goes over. And the tough thing is we've spent the last almost 12 months looking at this, and all those legislators are only going to have hours each to look at it. And we've struggled to absorb every aspect of it. How are they going to do it? Hopefully our report will help summarize all that in their minds, but it's still a complex issue, very much tinged by New Hampshire's personality. So
it's a heavy lift for sure.
It is.
It is.
That's an understatement.
We'll encourage all the legislative committees to spend some time on the website.
I suspect there'll be a lot of testimony.
Hopefully, just a reminder, and we'll talk about this on Monday, but as a reminder, the Carsey School will stay involved over the next several months. And one of our tasks we hope to accomplish is provide some orientations and briefings at various times during January and February, so legislators can find a time that's convenient to them and come on for an hour and a half or 2 hour briefing to really walk through the report.
Yeah. Well, in the old way, you'd pay for lunch and they would come. That was always the trick. If it's free food, they'll show up for the session.
We'll have to send them little vouchers for their local.
No, we can't use that word.
No vouchers.
Use vouchers.
Hey.
Well, school choice. I mean, lunch choice.
Lunch choice vouchers.
Yeah, lunch choice.
No, I'm good with that. So, all right. Great to see everybody again. Seems it's been a long time. Mel and Jay and I were just on a meeting with the New Hampshire Special Education Administrators Association. So
that's right.
Jane had invited us to give them a little briefing, and which we did, and that was good. That was good. A lot of familiar faces there too. A lot that have come before this commission. A lot that have come before joint House Senate education committees. It's great to see how many people are really that are engaged in our schools are also active in terms of helping develop education, public policy for education. So anyway, real good there. So today's meeting, I think it's a work group meeting, and I think it's sort of going to be a combination of adequacy and fiscal policy. I think just sort of taking the temperature of people. I heard Carrie talk about it as a 3-hour meeting. I'm sort of thinking it more like a 2-hour meeing, so that everybody can sort of get back to what they need to be doing today, and try to keep our work focused on areas that we think might be either the most contentious, so the handful of most contentious things, or things that we haven't really talked about, in the report yet. And so I've highlighted a few in fiscal policy. I think Bruce has a few in adequacy, and I think a big part of the fiscal policy is we want to introduce how we're approaching fiscal policy, and it's through examples. So examples that all show student equity being the #1 thing, and everything is focused on student equity, but there's different ways you can arrive at that. So we're essentially giving the general court and the governor's office a roadmap of different ways you can attack this problem. But what you can't throw out is student equity. And I'm hoping that's one of those core principles. I think it's one of those core principles that we've all, agreed on. So, so you might not like all, you might not like 1, 2, or 3 of the fiscal policy examples, but but they're really there to just show some different.
Yeah.
So the one that we haven't, we've obviously seen the 2 that were presented by AIR. The one we really haven't seen is the one that Bill and Dick have been working on based on the Massachusetts model. And so we'll probably spend about half of fiscal policy's time looking at that. So Jay's on the line right now. So I'm thinking it's a 2-hour meeting, half of it adequacy, half of it fiscal policy. And we'll just get through as much of it as possible. So we'll call this meeting to order. Work group meeting of the Commission to Study School Funding. Today is November 20th, 2020, just after 2 o'clock. And we'll just do a quick roll call of the folks present, as we do for all remote meetings, public meetings under the governor's emergency order. So I'll start it off. Dave Luno from Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund. And I see Mel.
Mel Myler calling in from Kentucky, New Hampshire.
Great. And I see Jay. We'll skip over Jay.
Sorry. Done eating, David, believe it or not. Jay from from Keene, alone in my office, my wife elsewhere in the house.
Great. Thanks, Jay. And Barbara?
Barbara Tremblay calling in from, I'm not calling in, I'm here in Keene at my home. My husband's in another part of the house.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And Val?
Val Zanchuk calling from his office in Jaffrey.
Great. Thanks. And Dick?
Yeah, Dick Ames. I'm here in Jaffrey in my home alone, although I haven't said before, but my wife is here also elsewhere in the house. I tend to leave that piece out, but she's as important as anything.
Great. Thanks, Dick. And Corinne?
Corinne Cascadden, my home office in Berlin, New Hampshire.
Thanks, Corinne. And Mary?
Mary Heath here in Manchester, and I'm here, and my husband's in the other room.
Great. Thanks, Mary. And Bill?
Hi, everybody. Bill Ardinger here in Concord at my home. My wife's in the house. It's great to see all of you, but it's particularly, I'm ringing a bell for an unbelievable colleague I've loved to work with on this, Mel Myler. I'm ringing the bell, Mel. It's great to see you, bud.
So, and we've got our team from the Carsey School. We've got Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is also present.
Great. And Carrie Portray?
Carrie Poetry. I'm here at the Carsey School in Durham. My colleague Michelle's in the other office space.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And Bruce Mallory?
All right, Bruce Mallory is at home in Kittery Point, Maine, family downstairs.
Okay, great. All right, so Bruce, you want to sort of refresh on the plan ahead here?
Sure. I assume you mean between the next 9 days, essentially. Let's
Yeah.
try to capture that, summarize that. So your exec team, Mel and Dave and Jay, have been hard at work with support from Jordan and Carrie and me, drafting these very final sections that'll go into the report, these work group reports, which will then lead to the overall findings that the commission will highlight and recommendations that the commission will highlight. So at the end of the day today, we will have language. I won't call it final language yet, but we'll have language for each of the work groups. We already have that for engagement. We're working on other parts of the final report at this time as well, including a significant section on accountability and data needs. All the background and descriptions of the history of the commission, the charge of the commission, some of the key background historical aspects of legislative and judicial action, are a section on the AIR report and the key findings from the AIR report and how that's informed the thinking of the commission all along. This will all be framed back into the larger framework around design thinking to remind folks of the kind of the sequence of conversations that we've had using that. And then the report will end with a series of, well, recommendations, obviously, and then a whole series of appendices, including the work group, the categorical aid briefs that were written. The appendices will include any individual member statements that folks have chosen to submit. A reminder, and we'll do this again Monday, that we'll need those by Friday, November 27th, in order to include in the November 30th version. So Monday we'll meet for 2 hours. Sometime over the weekend, my goal is later on Saturday or no later than Sunday morning, everybody will receive a complete draft of the commission's final report. There may be a few holes in it that are still in, but they won't be substantive holes. All the substantive information will be in what people receive over the weekend. On Monday, we'll walk through that. Opportunities for any substantive concerns or suggestions. And Dave, I think maybe a sense of the group on Monday, not formally, but at least a sense of the group that this represents overall our thinking and some form of consensus. We'll then take whatever we get comes out of the Monday meeting and do the final version of the report, no longer a draft, and get that out to everybody prior to our final meeting on Monday, November 30th, where I assume, Dave, you'll be wanting to take some kind of formal action on the report before we submit it no later than close of business day on December 1st.
I think that that pretty much talks about the next 10 days. Yeah.
Somewhere in there, you'll gather with a few people in your pods to celebrate Thanksgiving, but
yeah.
The rest of
Sounds easy.
Yeah. So, so good. Yeah, on December 1st, on Tuesday, it'll be on the governor's desk. So, so anyway, a lot to still do between now and then, but I think we've got a good cut now of all three of all three work group reports. I think they definitely stand well up by themselves. Again, having a chance to look at them together is something that probably only Bruce has been able to do so far. And but from what I've seen in the adequacy report and the fiscal policy report, there's no major sort of conflicting points. There seems to be a strong coordination, and even though a lot of these things were typed by Jay, typed by Bruce, typed by Jordan, typed by me, that we're all picking up what was what had been put down over the last 11 months of commission work. So anyway, sorry to take up all this time. Bruce, since we left off with adequacy yesterday, why don't we pick up there, and then in about 50 minutes or so or an hour, we'll switch gears to fiscal policy.
Yeah, and this may not need an hour on adequacy.
Yeah,
A lot
that'd be
of
great.
folks on today's call were with us yesterday. Others have seen versions of this all along. So I'm just going to pick out, as you suggested, Dave, a handful, maybe a handful of sections here, some of which are actually new, believe it or not, but mostly are kind of a refinement of, and Jay obviously will want to guide us through this conversation as well. But let me just gonna jump to, this is the findings at the top. And let me jump to this new section. This is one of those forest for the trees kind of sections, because this is something that this topic that number 4 addresses is something we've all talked about, but we just had never gotten the language into the adequacy work group finding relative to the ECM. And what the purpose of this section is highlighted in the yellow here, is to caution against monkeying with the model, essentially, monkeying with the formula that led to the identification of the differentiated weights and the allocate and the identification of funds needed for all students, regardless of need and regardless of community, to have the opportunity to achieve at statewide average student outcomes. Because if there were any arbitrary or even not so arbitrary effort to change those weights or to change the other assumptions that went into that statistical calculation, then the integrity of that model is lost, and you've lost any sense of being on solid ground for a rational and empirical approach to costing the opportunity for an adequate education, et cetera, et cetera. So this language finally explicitly, as I say, cautions against any other, any changes in that model. At least that's our recommendation. We can't control what folks might do with it in the future, but they should understand the impact of, pulling one leg out of the stool, the whole stool is going to collapse. And there may be unanticipated consequences for the amount of money that gets distributed and the way that money gets distributed relative to our intention to assure that the students with the greatest need and the communities with the fewest resources have that opportunity for an adequate education. So I'll stop there. I can either, we can talk about each one individually or just introduce you to the top issues here. Dave, what's your preference? Or Jay may have comments here too.
Well, Bruce, if you just stop at number 2 for a second. That's been added as well.
Yes, thank you. I didn't highlight it now simply because
Okay.
it seemed like a
It seems
factual
pretty
statement.
uncontroversial, yeah.
Yeah, we hope. But it is this key finding here from the AAR, obviously lower outcomes are related to lower total student spending, which in turn is related to lower property values. Again, I think just raising up these AAR findings is critical.
Can I, sorry, go Barbara.
Oh, yes, thanks, Bill. I was very happy to see both number 2 there and number 4. It seemed that we needed that foundation. We have been saying it all along, but had not yet appeared in this piece. And I think it's fundamental to have this in this piece because assuredly down the road, there will be some fooling around with the calculations, but we have set it forth. There it is. And I was very pleased to see that in there.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Sorry, on number 2, and I'm sorry I missed the meeting yesterday. The one graph that I'm remembering from the AIR report that had the highest correlation value was the graph that had on the horizontal axis free and reduced lunch, so a measure of poverty, and on the vertical axis it had outcome factor. This particular framing of that talks about oh wait, let me just see, I just lost 2. Where was I looking?
We all lost it.
We just lose 2.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. I was looking at something on something hit my keyboard.
All right.
So just leave that there before you kill it. It talks about a relationship between total spending and student outcomes. And it also indicates a relationship between lower property values and either one of the for either outcomes or spending. The strongest relationship, as I read the AIR stuff, was between poverty and outcomes. These other 2, there was one between, it had a pretty good, like a 50.50, 0.5 relationship to spending to outcomes, but it was lower in terms of property values and outcomes, or property values and spending. And I just wanted to nudge back on the team who was working hard yesterday to say, would there be any objection to including in there the most amazing graph in the AIR report, which I think is that higher poverty is related to to lower outcomes. That's the highest relationship. This kind of points on two relationships, or maybe three, it's unclear to me, that aren't as clear in the report. Mr. Chairman, we're of the advocacy work group. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I definitely do relative to the poverty factor. We don't have property valuations, right? It's just that we know that free and reduced lunch is we have opted to measure lower property valuations by the incidence of free and reduced lunch in the schools.
I'm glad you're pointing it. I don't think we've done that, Jay. I think that the free and reduced lunch is a proxy for poverty, but when they actually looked at the data of property valuation differentials, and I think it was outcome and spending, the correlations were not as high. So at least I would like to emphasize in this number 2, the highest correlation, which was directly between free and reduced lunch, again, as a proxy for poverty, and spending. And the reason I'm focusing on that is I believe that's, back to design measure, that's the best evidence of the greatest problem in our current system.
So Bill, I'm looking at how to change this a bit so that it picks up your point without drastically changing it. I don't think it's right the way it is now, that it says student outcomes are related to lower total spending per student, because it's really per student after taking into account indicators of differentiated need.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was the spending gap.
Yes, sir. Oops, did we lose him?
Sorry, Dick. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm here, but so I wanted to make that point that as phrased right now, it's not right, because it's not per student, it's per weighted student, to do it in shorthand. And I don't know actually offhand what our reports showed on lower property valuations. I think generally my sense is that it's true that that there is a correlation between student outcomes and ability to raise money, which is in turn related to lower property valuations. But I don't know what we've got.
I think I'm happy. I think it was just, whereas the one relationship, poverty to outcomes, was like up at a 0.9.
Yeah.
The other two there is a relationship, Dick, but it was really low. It was like it was under 0.3 for property values. And honestly, I came in from outside, as I'm gross on this camera, but I think I didn't have the report up. But if Bruce, if you could just double check that data and frame this thing that to emphasize, I think, the highest correlation point. I think the key takeaway that I've been mentioning to folks is we've got very high average spending, very high average quality, very high average outcomes, which is part of quality. But the real problem is that we have low spending that's correlated with poverty. And the job is to tilt that curve to Massachusetts type curves, progressivity. And I'd love to have that emphasized in this draft.
Yeah, so thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. And actually, the other exhibit in the report that I think is relevant here is Exhibit 21, which is, again, very high correlation of 0.73 the difference between outcomes and spending. And you see a pretty tight scatter plot and line in that as well. That's why you get that 0.73 correlation. But that suggests the difference between spending and outcomes as well. So we can make this.
Those are the two I remember. Those are the
Again?
two relationships that I remember were high.
Yeah.
I think it's unfortunate that in this report, we cannot have a video of Bill talking about the shift of the access line on that particular graph. There you go. That's what we need right there, right there.
I'd also direct our attention to page 20 in the report. It's the summary of AIR's findings. And that is what this is summarizing.
Can you say
Good.
that
We'll
page
pull some
again,
language
Jay?
out of that to do with this.
Jay, can you say that page again?
Page 20,
Okay. I also
second
put the link,
paragraph of the summary.
I also put the link in.
Good. That's eagle eyes here on this. Shall we continue then? Any comments on 4 and the point that we're trying to make?
Yeah, Bruce, on 4, if we go back to the simulator, there's plenty of space for custom weights to be added, which is basically allowing people
Right.
to play around with things. Should that be eliminated on that model, on that web, on the Excel page? Because we're basically saying you need to use the recommended weights to get this thing to work right. So if we don't give people the option of playing with it, then they can't. And I'm just wondering if, because it just opens up a Pandora's box of different approaches, all of which have ramifications that would be hard to measure because they diverge from the optimal set of circumstances as defined by the model.
So Val, I think
Yep.
you're, I think you're right. You're absolutely right on that. But just a potential, just to challenge that thought, because you're absolutely right as far as the evidence-based nature of that model. But if we give people a chance to play around with the weights and they see how even tweaking them a little bit causes things to, go haywire quickly, maybe it helps them better understand that the math behind the model is the way to stick it down.
Unless they have nefarious purposes and they're going to, try to push their pet way,
Yeah,
distorting this.
yeah.
And
Val-
unfortunately, you can't really measure it easily.
Val, I think your point is absolutely in the right direction. I think we're a little bit constrained because we're a public body. And I think the right way to remedy your point is actually, I like this paragraph 4, because I think we have to make the data from the AIR report and the simulation models available as they provided it to the commission. And I think we have to do that. I think we just have to be overwhelmingly clear of 2 points. Number one, I have not heard the commission consider or recommend the simulation model as a proposal that it would suggest would be a new education funding piece of legislation. I've not heard that from anyone who recommended. I think we have to make that very clear, and we are, I think, making that clear, but we got to be clear on that. Second is your point, and this kind of gets to it. We are not recommending, we're recommending the ECM model with the weights that reflect the data work that AIR, and we're not recommending alternative weighting. And maybe Bruce, this is where, while the simulation model permits various manipulations, the commission did not consider or did not propose or recommend any weighting other than the weighting that AIR recommended. Or Val, let me throw that on the table. I just think from a legal perspective, we got to make this available to the public. It's a public document, but we can also make available in as bright a way as possible what our views are on the model. And so, Val, what do you think? Can we tighten this up a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I've just taken some notes here that I'll be able to go back and, what I'm hearing is the body of 4 as it stands says
It does that. I think you're really on the right track.
I'm glad.
And I think however we word it though, we need to recognize that the commission actually did look at
Other
alternatives with different weights and found that if you eliminate the school size weight, then the ELL weight goes negative.
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
you know, and what story does that tell? So, I mean, it doesn't mean that ELL students are less expensive to educate.
No, but it shows
Doesn't
how.
mean that.
No.
But Bill, you've used the phrase all along. This is a predictive cost model.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It uses factors A, B, C, and D to get there.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that an ELL student costs umpteen dollars or that a free and reduced student costs umpteen dollars. That's, you know, these are factors to get to the predicted costs.
But I suspect a lot of electrons will flow through that model once it gets to the legislature, because everybody's going to play with that spreadsheet to see what impact it's going to have on their town and manipulate it to their advantage.
Agreed.
Not being cynical or anything, I'm just commenting.
And Val, to that point, you're absolutely right. And it happened in Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
They did a report in like 2016 or 2017, and it took 3 or 4 years for the legislature to get around to it. And it's a sausage process. So you're right. But the commission can leave a marker of what it meant.
Yeah. And I think the simulator is going to be extremely heavily used because it summarizes all of the things that we've been looking at and shows you what the impact is of, changes in tax rates or whatever else that happens. I mean, if you want to see what's going to happen if you do this, the simulator will be the fastest way to get there.
Well, it's always the first look. I mean, the people are always going to have that first look of their districts and their representative areas. So.
Okay.
And just to get, as you visualize, how does this get implemented? We have a total number of students, and we know that. Now we know what the weighted number of students are based on actual costs.
Yeah.
And now we can develop a funding model based on that weighted student number.
So, good. Moving along. I'm just going to move us along a little bit because I think
just one quick question going back up above in the findings. When we talk about number 2 there, I guess it was, we can just go back up to that. About the average outcomes. I think part of that whole thing was that at least AIR's initial premise for their analysis was that the average outcomes are good and the average amount of spending is good. And there was no recommendation to necessarily spend more money. It was just that it wasn't being spent efficiently. I think that was their comment at the beginning. And, if people are concerned about spending, we're not suggesting here that the amount of money being spent should go up. We're just saying that it should be distributed differently so that there's no question, there's no concern here that the commission's coming out saying we need to spend more money to get things up. It's that we don't need to spend more money.
And I think that point is made in the fiscal policy report.
Okay, I just wonder if we want to reiterate it here, since we're talking about average outcomes, should we be saying something about average spending? And that there's no recommendation to increase spending to reach adequacy.
I think that could be, I know that's our premise, and I think in application, it may not be so. And it's because those that are spending a lot today will be spending a lot in the future.
Mhm.
And while we're recommending leveling that field, we're not going to be recommending taking money away as the model does.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
Yeah,
I
so
would also offer Val a thought on that is the AIR model, as we know, starts with that total spending concept and assumes that the total spending is sufficient. And then it does what you're saying, reallocating. I think that it's important that our recommendations here do include encouragement for funding levels for things like building aid and CTE that are more robust. And to my mind, when we use an AIR model that is based on total spending, in some sense, I think the presentation that the commission is urging, and we haven't gotten to this, is that right now we have this view that adequacy is some smaller portion, 779 million of a 3 billion expenditure. I think the model that we're encouraging with ECM, with AIR, is a holistic model. And in that case, I think the commission has spoken about a desire to add some funding, especially in areas of like building aid and CTE and perhaps special ed. So I guess I'd just be cautious. And I think that's okay. That's a recommendation that we can make. And I think it's fundamental to the evaluation ultimately by a court or anyone else about the state share and how the state is working to address the inequities that are in the current system.
So I think we're going to get to that.
Okay, great.
But while we're on this, and Bill, what you were just saying sort of reminded me of this, and I don't know if we've got it anywhere, is how the ECM responds to different outcome objectives. And I think it scales linearly. Like, it doesn't mean that the bottom end, the schools that are need to spend more, that stays the same, and it adjusts the other end. I think everything adjusts at the same rate. Is that true, Jay?
You mean all outcomes adjust at the same rate?
So the ECM is benchmarked at state average, right? And so if you wanted to be, let's say, one above state average or one below state average, you would increase the ECM by, and I'm just making up the number. If you wanted to increase it to one above state average, you would increase the ECM by 20% across everything.
Costs, right?
Yeah, yes. So it's not that the cost of Manchester goes up by 40% and the cost in Hillsborough only goes up by 15%. It's everybody goes up the same amount or everybody goes down the same amount. And that holds equity constant.
It's about true. I played with the model to get it from 50, from state average to 40%. It wound up taking 125 million out of the model.
And it came out proportionately from every town.
If you go back, yeah, right.
Yeah, that's the, so we might want to put that in the findings somewhere.
I think one of the things that isn't in the findings, we ought to think about it. There's nothing in the findings about what is the average cost. I'm And I think that if it's because we're a little embarrassed about saying that we spend $17,000 a student, I think we all know that we spend $17,000 a student.
I've got it in fiscal policy findings.
That's very much in fiscal policy, is what I was going to say.
Good. All right.
And obviously, indeed, New Hampshire DOE most recent data has the spending amount. That 17 is from a different period. The number that they get to on their summary of expenditures is in plus 19.
Yeah. I just, ran that comparison, pulling the 18, 19 numbers out. It comes out to 19,000 and some dollars, including every cost.
I think I know where the 17 came from. It's like the census data from a couple years
Well,
ago.
if you take out federal money and some other things, you can get down to that number.
Oh, absolutely right. That's exactly right.
Yep.
So Dave, will this issue of total spending, per pupil spending and total aggregate be addressed in fiscal policy? Again, a reminder that we're going to have a whole separate section in the report that presents total combined findings and recommendations where this will be addressed.
Yeah, so Jordan and I have a big section of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And you could move that out of fiscal policy and I mean, however you weave this together, Bruce, it's telling a story, right? So if that needs to be told up front, take it out of fiscal policy, put it up front. I mean, however reads best. So.
May I make just a back on 2 for a second? I'd just like to make a brief editorial comment. It seems to me that it should say in that first sentence that the average outcomes are in the top tier of the United States. Just so we make clear that it's who we're talking. When you just say states, if you say United States or all states, that's fine. That's good too.
Yep.
Good.
Good catch.
I'm going to move us along here.
All right, we gotta keep going.
Wow.
To the first page.
Yeah. On our report's only 6 pages. Wait till you see fiscal policy.
Yeah, right.
Jay, you've got 25 minutes left.
Let's.
Okay, so quickly under recommendations, I don't think there's too much more here, but you'll always surprise me. There have been I think Karina raised the question yesterday in this first recommendation. It simply said in that one, phased in over a multi-year period. And there was a request for more specificity. And so it now reads 3 bienniums.
I think it's biennia.
Okay. But we'll use the correct Latin.
Oh, that looks strange.
Well, I think most people would probably recognize biennium.
6 years.
But look, it won't self-correct.
No, this is correct. No, biennium is the right word.
Yeah, it is when you can talk about it in several fora that we'll have after it. 6-year period.
All right. We'll take a straw vote on this.
No, I'm fine.
But the goal here, and this is a conversation earlier today with Jay and Dave, that this does peg it to our budget cycles, to the biennial budget cycles. And people, that's a familiar way of thinking about policy phase in.
And to be clear, so that we maybe have a common theme, hopefully what we're suggesting gets introduced in the second year of the next biennium. That the transition starts to move so that the real progress continues over the next 4 years beyond this. So that's why I think this is couched in a manner that's realistic time frame.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think it's also important to point out too that in order to do that, you actually have to have some very small changes in the year preceding that, so that revenues are in place when the DOE needs to make a timely draw from the ETF, from the trust fund.
Item 5 is an effort to clarify the wording around special education students who are attending public chartered schools. Mary and Jane and others that helped us a lot the other day with this language. And so I think I've captured what the intent was, because the districts seem to be liable for expenses for special education students or attending public charter schools above and beyond what the weights alone would suggest for those students. The chartered schools, the public charter schools charge or assess the local school district in a way that sometimes isn't rationalized. We'll get to this a little bit further down in the categorical aid section as well. But this was my effort to try to name what that problem was. The current approach should be changed in order to assure the district in which the student is enrolled, because remember, the student is still counted in that local district, that district has sufficient funding to cover any additional charges assessed by the chartered school.
Yeah, so really important here, Bruce, that and I felt strongly about this. I continue to feel strongly about it, that the ECM does not just tell you what a small school costs to run, or what an ELL, how much an ELL student costs to educate, or how much a special education student costs to educate. It doesn't tell you that. It tells you in the aggregate how much it costs to operate a school district. And so I think it's really important that services for students aren't priced based on whatever the weighting factor is for special education or ELL, but in fact are justified based on the services that the student needs. Because I mean, this isn't, this isn't providing special education services at a charter school based on whatever the generic weight is applied for a certain student. I mean, do I have this completely wrong?
No, the question is how to say that best, and whether this captures that or not. So the district does receive an allocation based on the number of special education students it has. That's a weighted allocation. But then if they in turn, a third party actually provides the service and charges more, then the district is left hanging with it for the difference.
But I guess what I'm saying is the district would be in that position whether the whatever the services they're providing, whether they're providing them in district or out of district. And and the important part is that the costs are justified based on the needs of the student, and that they're at I don't know if you want to call it market rate, but not inflated, not, that they're reasonable for the service.
So
like prescription drug pricing.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to make this better or clearer.
I don't know either.
So let's leave it that if you have anybody has thoughts about getting at Dave's point on item 5, please send that along.
Yeah, I'd have Jane read that, Bruce.
Hey, Corinne?
I'd have Jane read that, but I'd also drop the ED off the 2 charters at the end of each line. It doesn't need to be ED.
Okay, somebody at one point.
Yeah, but Jane might be able to wordsmith that. I know what you're saying. She had concerns about the rates and not ever knowing what the rates were until they got the bill.
Because there's no guidelines for it.
Right.
There's no rate setting process. That's what the concern is, that we have to have some kind of rate set. We do for private schools, but for charter schools, we have no form of rate setting. So they can charge the local school district, who is responsible, and David's right, it's based on the IEP, but there's no rate setting. And I think that needs to be in place.
So that is addressed here specifically in the categorical aid section, based on our conversation the other day.
Yeah.
they have
That's
to be
perfect, yeah.
setting a reasonable
Yeah.
rate
That's fine.
for
Yeah.
services provided, at a rate setting guidance for, and I can go, I'll go back and change to charter schools. I thought it was publicly.
No, I gotta disagree.
Okay.
Well, look at the statute. The entire statute on charter schools is chartered.
Yeah, that's why it's here. Yeah. So we'll be consistent with.
They
Well,
are,
the statute has it.
backing into it, they are actually publicly chartered schools.
Okay.
Ah,
They may change it to change their
Yeah.
name so that they don't have the ED on it, but and I agree with that too.
Yeah.
But
All right, well, you gotta be consistent.
Okay,
Okay, I also would agree to have Jane look over that number 5 one more time. The
Absolutely.
wording doesn't seem to me to be quite right. What do you think, Mary and Corinne? There's a little off there, not quite right with what we want to say.
Well, I'm actually okay with that statement because he's, when you go further down, that's where it's.
All right,
exactly
because
what
it
we wanna
carries
do.
it there.
yeah,
All right.
you've got the data collection. You basically are
Right.
putting the Department of Ed in the same position the New Hampshire Insurance Department is when collecting data on medical procedures. And so we
Yeah.
know what the average cost is. We know if, what that should cost.
Because
So-
the department does it now for private schools.
Correct.
Right.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah, I think it says what it needs to.
I'll send a note to Jane though. and
Okay,
This makes sense to her.
thanks.
And again, Dave, any suggestions? Number 7, we had a discussion the other day on how it is we wanted to state this. But I think this is a key, this really is a key statement right here. And I'm sure this will show up in our top line findings and recommendations. The value of constitutional adequacy will vary for local communities in a manner that addresses those communities with the greatest need as determined by student outcome factors. And I think I'm channeling lots and lots of members of the commission, I think.
Is the word value correct, though? I mean, are we talking about the worthiness of constitutional adequacy or the cost of constitutional adequacy?
Good point. Yep. Value has lots of meanings here, doesn't it?
Yep. Because the value should be the same if we're talking about worthiness, I think. So,
Mhm.
You
Or
mean
is
that
it
the
price?
premise?
We could talk about price too, couldn't we?
yeah,
I think that's the connotation. It's not a normative kind of value. This is
Yes.
a valuation of constitution. So when you determine people typically think about this in input model context as we're going to now estimate the cost of a constitutionally adequate education. But in terms of what we're doing, we're predicting how much spending is required to achieve constitutional adequacy. And that's a kind of value. It actually produces a number that's a value. And so I thought that's what I read in that. And I personally like that number. I think that number, the value, maybe paren or cost paren of constitutional adequacy should vary per district. It should not be the same or uniform in every district. And I think that is the leading finding of the entire commission. And
right. But the next paragraph down, we state the commission defines the cost as the financial resources needed by each student in each district to have the opportunity. So we're already defining an adequate education is really defining the cost of it. So what's the difference between what's in 7 and what's in that paragraph right below it?
I do have a comment on the paragraph below it, but I think it's a slightly different comment. What do you think is when we say we think the support or that the public school finance program should cause resources to be higher in districts with greater needs as determined by I don't care how we say it, but I think I agree with Bruce. That is the top line takeaway from the commission's work.
I would just add the word cost and call it the cost value in number 7.
Gotcha.
Cost value.
What does that mean?
Well, it just means that the value you're talking about is related to the dollar versus
Or financial resources for
what you think.
constitutional adequacy. I agree. I like Corinne where you're going. I know what we mean. It is a number. It's a predicted set of resources that are required to achieve
Right, it's a
constitutional.
dollar value.
It's a
It has
dollar.
to do with
value.
dollars.
That's why I kind of like value. I think to some extent, when you're dealing with an input methodology, you're trying to tally up a set of costs. So the word cost makes greater sense in that context. I think the ECM model drives to a different resource valuation.
So I look at cost and financial resources as two different things. So, the cost is what, of something you want to buy, and the financial resource is how much is in your wallet.
Which is, I think, that's why I liked the word value there originally. Because I don't think we're talking about the cost of a library or the cost of, I think it's the value of financial resources is what we're talking about.
Yeah, but I read it as value meaning worthiness, and that doesn't seem to fit.
Make sense.
No.
It shouldn't be worthiness. That's a moral judgment.
So what do you think of dollar value?
Like that. That's what I thought it meant.
Just cost.
Yeah, I mean,
What's the word cost?
Yeah.
The cost is what we're talking about.
Just use cost.
Cost value is a phrase that leaves, to interpretation. What does that mean? Cost is cost.
Yeah, cost of adequacy should vary for local communities.
That's what I think what we're saying.
Yeah, and I would now we're like wordsmithing.
Yeah.
Changing should to will, because we don't force it to change. It will change based on what the ECM says.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if every district was identical, had identical kids, identical everything, then the cost wouldn't vary.
Dave?
Good for me. Works for me.
John, yeah.
Can I suggest a slight change? How about the commission concludes or has determined the cost of adequacy varies?
Well, I think we've said, see, these are recommendations now. And John, the way you just put it was a finding.
Understood, but just to be even clearer, that we're not, that's our determination.
Right, and so in this very first finding at the top, the opportunity is based on education that responds to the differentiated student needs. And I think that's at least implicit here. And we're adopting the model. Yeah, I'm just trying to be clear about what a finding versus a recommendation is.
Or the commission recommends the legislature adopt a funding model that recognizes the cost of constitutional adequacy varies.
Yeah. B squared, bingo, Beardmore.
That's good, John.
Once a month, I'll add something of value. I promise.
You have this above earthly quality to your voice today. Judgmental.
I just renovated a new room to be my office, and there's nothing in it yet other than me.
And your voice.
So the echo's awful, I'm sorry.
Now that was a good clarification there, John, thank you. This is what we're recommending, that the legislature adopt a funding model that recognizes that the cost varies.
Yeah.
Take out
okay.
the should, and I think
Should vary,
I think
should
John
vary.
said, he just said varies.
Should not should vary, varies.
It
Varies
varies, it's a statement.
in a manner, right? So, yeah,
Good.
wow.
So
Good
in this, moving down, we have 1 minute left according to the chair for our report.
Oh, you get five minutes
Well, we got 5 minutes now.
because we started, or 7 minutes. We started late.
We can get halfway.
So just a tweak here on this definitional line. We added each student in each school district, just to really drive the point home that this is a student-centered definition of the cost of an adequate education. And so I think that there was,
What we had there before was each student. We didn't.
oh, in each school district, thank you.
So I want to pick on this one for a second.
Me too.
So is this saying that in town A, that a student might have, or that a school district might need additional financial resources to meet the needs of the student, compared to town B, which has, which is very well resourced and doesn't need the financial resources. Is this a fiscal policy statement, or is this a costing statement, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, it's how we based our cost model.
Is this related to this? I think, Dave, your point is getting to the same issue. The model that we had predicted the total cost that, for example, the Manchester School District, total resources that it would need to achieve a particular outcome. It didn't determine a cost for each student in that district. It was a district-wide calculation. I don't understand what this red insert is trying to do, because I don't think it's consistent with how the model works. It does, in order to scale to a total number, it'll take into account the number of pupils, but I don't think it's determining adequate education cost needed by each student. It's determining the the predicted cost to achieve an outcome for district district.
Well, I'll disagree because it's all based on a weighted student total. Again, we don't have 168,000 students going into the model. We have a weighted student total that's 400,000 students.
But the model that with the step one of the model did not determine the cost, the predicted cost using students. It used the outcomes. It used graduation rates, and that came to, in order to, by regression, to get us to the targeted outcome, it predicted a total cost. And
So-
what I'm worried about here is the thought that we might be saying that we're determining an adequacy cost per pupil, and that suggests to me something very different, which it could be misconstrued, and I think there are people who do want to misconstrue like this, that we're creating a price per pupil that someone could argue should go with the pupil. I don't hear anyone on this commission supporting that outcome. And I just want to make, it's something I've been very sensitive about. I believe in the common enterprise of a common public school, per Horace Mann. And I don't want to leave, Bill Ardinger doesn't want to leave any uncertainty that we're suggesting that there's some number per pupil that then if that pupil goes somewhere else, they take that number with them. This is a district investment a common asset investment.
Yeah, I hear the point for sure. And is it as simple, Bill, or too simplistic to change these each words to every?
Yeah, I think that's where you need to go. I agree with that.
Every school.
So just one other thought on this though. I think maybe we're connecting, the first time I read this, I connected the words each student in each school district with to have the opportunity to achieve the level of average. That's how I connected those two things.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think if instead you read this as the financial resources needed by each student in each school district, then it's a different connection. And it's not the connection that we're looking for.
Okay.
And I think it goes to Bill's point that we're looking at an aggregate cost here, and we're looking to really, develop the concept that each student in each school district has the opportunity to achieve.
I probably blew it when I read it. So
No, I the first time I read it and the second time I read it differently. So
Yeah.
So I think
I like that.
Defines the cost of an adequate education as the cost for.
Or you could put via
Needed by
ECP
each
reference.
district to provide every student with an
Yeah.
opportunity for an adequate education.
That would do it.
Good. It's either provide with the opportunity or to enable every student to have.
That's fine.
I'd get rid of financial resources and I'd put cost back in there.
It's in there. Define the cost of an adequate education, and then you can get rid of it. Cost of an adequate education needed by each district to provide, and maybe Dick's got a better framing for that.
Yeah, all right.
Should you reference the ECM? For example, you're defining, the commission defines the cost of an adequate education via using, I don't know how you would word it, using ECM as needed.
Below here, we go into what the ECM is. So I think it hangs together that way.
It ties together, okay.
So Dave or Jay, tell me where we are with this sentence. You take financial resources out, therefore.
I would, I think you could continue to work on, to develop this. But I think without over wordsmithing, defines the cost of an adequate education as the cost.
Mhm.
For each school district to provide every student to, I think that's, yeah.
Well, the reason I think resources, I don't care if financial is in there, that could disappear, but the statute right now says determine the necessary specific resource elements to be included. And I know we're going to move away from that specific definition, but it does talk about resource. Although on the other hand, it's the cost of an adequate education.
Yeah.
So defines the cost of an adequate education as the resources needed.
Or back to Corinne, is it? I still want to make sure I don't. Ms. Cascadden.
Corinne.
Corinne. Your suggestion, which is tie it to the model, which is defines the cost of an adequate education as
via the model
predicted as the predicted cost, the predicted cost required to enable each school district to provide every student with an opportunity to achieve at the average level of performance outcomes. I think that's getting in the right direction.
Well, let me ask you a question, Bill. If you do that, are you saying that an adequate education, the cost of an adequate education is the ECM amount?
Well, that gets to this very, you're right. You're right. I think that brings, I don't know. I think we're saying that the total resources required or predicted equal the ECM number. That's the truism, but this looked like someone wanted to define the cost of adequate education as that number. You're right. If for example, you guys have heard me before, if the first and last dollar rule is real, there's no way this works.
Now let's just take this language. The predicted cost is the ECM. That's the prediction. And it's an estimate, it's a prediction. And we've talked about it before. And we've talked about whether that's an adequate education, that's the cost of an adequate education, or is it something less? We've talked about that.
Yeah.
And I don't really know where we're at right now on this, but this seems to be taking predicted cost and making it the adequate education level. And that's, well, I think you get my point.
I agree with that point. Probably we're really talking about what the model does.
Well, that's
It's
fine.
a total cost model.
I think whereas as the cost needed by each school. Whether I don't know that predicted is going to help and I think Bruce, your point was that further down we talk about how we arrive at cost.
Yeah.
That it's a prediction. I leave the word there for the time being, but I don't think it is going to be needed.
Or based on, you could use the word based on predicted cost.
Have we defined as a commission, to Dick's point, have we actually defined the cost of an adequate education?
That's what we're trying to do.
That's what we're doing here.
Yes, we defined a predicted cost in the ECM.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly
right. But what's
average is?
But the idea there is that the cost of an adequate education is the cost to educate every student to, or no, the cost for every student to have the opportunity for a for an equitable outcome, for a state average outcome, for whatever objective outcome the state determines.
Without speaking for Dick, I think he's identifying what you just said was an important difference, which is what should the target outcome level be to run the ECM model at? Should it be statewide average? Should it be higher? Should it be lower?
So just from a and I don't want to take a lot of time talking about this, but there are numbers in the ECM, the nominal ECM is at 0, statewide average. If that's the target, what that means is over time the statewide average gets better.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So that I think is the direction you want to be on, certainly not going the other way. And as you obviously for all ECM target points above 0, that would be true. It's probably true for all ECM target points above minus something too, but I don't know what that number is. But What's also probably true is below some ECM number of minus something, your state performance will start to decline, I think. I don't know what that number is. And that's certainly not the place you want to be. Is that what, does that?
Are we saying to achieve at the level of, to achieve a defined statewide outcome level? That obviously begs the question of which level are we? Is the commission recommending the 0, Dave, or is it recommending, or is it just saying to achieve a target outcome, the process?
I think that's all part of fiscal policy that's to
Okay.
be developed by the legislature. You know,
So
but I
maybe,
think what we're saying is fiscal policy, and we say it in the fiscal policy section, centers on student equity.
yes.
I think this needs to say average statewide outcome. I think everything we've done is back the.
Yeah.
I think that works.
That's what the model is based on.
Yeah.
Not the same term.
And I think at the level of is, you know, that can be shortened up to achieve average statewide outcome. At which point we've now deleted 2 prepositions, 1 article, and I think we're wordsmithing.
I still don't get it, Jay. So, Jay, if I may, so Jay, are you saying that the 2.9 whatever billion dollars is the cost of adequacy? That's the predicted cost.
Yeah, I'm fine with using just cost as opposed to predicted, but yeah, no, I think the model, I think we said is that, I mean, you needed a number to peg it off of, right? And we know what the outcome of spending 2.9 is it achieves a very high average student outcome. So no, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the final word on what the cost of adequate education is, but it is the basis of how we.
Basis, that would be fine. As the basis defines the cost of adequate education as, I can't do it right here.
So if we're successful over time in getting the below average performers up to average, the average that exists now has to be populated by a lot of people who are getting well above average.
Mm-hmm.
So if you bring everyone up to the average of this past year, I would suspect that several years in the future, you would actually decrease your expenses because you're going to be above that average. Then you can decide whether you want to be there or not, or cut the spending back to bring the whole average back down. I mean, you know, it depending on where you set your average, and you know, because it's not a fixed point, it's going to be a moving point every year. You could be moving up and down, trying to play the game of bringing things up or down cost wise to get back to a past average. You'd be chasing history.
You're right. Yeah, which is why this needs a 5 to 10 year kind of look, right?
Yeah.
Bruce?
Yes.
I think we can replace needed by with the word for.
Yeah, good.
Great, we've eliminated 1 word.
All right.
That's good.
1 word left.
Excellent use of time.
Yeah. Time to move on.
This is important. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why it's in italics. This
If you
is.
want to move on, that's fine. Because you need time here, David,
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the other.
So-
What I want to make sure, Bill, make sure that we're capturing this different. We've got 3 words or 3 terms for adequacy. One that's based on performance, one that's based on outcomes, and one that's based on constitutional adequacy. The introduction of constitutional adequacy needs to be framed a little bit, and hopefully we've done that and preserved each of those terms in the manner that they're currently in statute or understood through rulings.
Yeah, and that's why the word performance does show up here, because that's an RSA term relative to district performance. How well are districts performing with attendance rates, graduation rates, and achievement test scores? So that's a performance-based definition. And that focuses then leads to focus on outcomes. There's some nuance or splitting some hairs here, but I'll try to be as consistent as I can throughout. That if we're using statutory language that references performance, that's what we use. But this is an outcomes-based model that's about student outcomes. What's happening with students?
I think it was really good to have this discussion here.
I do too.
Because this is a giant point. What I would suggest, Jay, that we finish going through the next 3 pages of this, and just everybody in the commission has the document, right?
Yep.
So if you can just sort of take us to the highlighted parts. What's the concern? And then we can each sort of work on our own leading up to Monday.
Yeah, okay. So this next section, there's not really much different in this next section. This was the piece where Val had raised the question, I think yesterday.
Yeah. About
the difference between input-based and an outcomes-based formula. And we've tried to make that as clear as we can here. There's some slight tweaking of language here. It's essentially the meaning remains the same. So this is an area that, again, Val, you can take a look at this, others, to be sure that we've made that distinction, that we're not abandoning the current language about the resource elements, that, we're not throwing those out. We recognize there are resource elements, and the important question is not what those resource elements cost. The important question is, how do we produce student outcomes consistent with our definition that we were just discussing. And then that allows some measurement of what the value of what we call constitutionally adequate education is, some of Bill Ardner's language here. So in keeping with what Dave just suggested, take a quick look at this. I will send this latest version of this document to everybody on the commission right after today's call. And you can send me back your suggestions. We'll take them up on Monday.
Yeah.
And that, in terms of other changes and what the prior version of this was, I think we, again, we already looked at this. We referenced this rate setting issue around special education and public charter schools. And I think I do think this is now, there needs to be rate setting. It's not just arbitrary charges from charters to. And I really actually, and those are the only things that were highlighted.
Yeah.
Good.
Good.
Well, but before we leave the adequacy thing, one of the things that I wanted to make sure we capture, and that is, we've talked about the outcome based upon 3 components. One, attendance, outcomes of scores, and graduation rates.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to lose the concept of what's it mean when you say graduation rates. I have a hard time saying that, but it means that in a school district, a student has met the outcomes that the school district has set. So when you start talking about competencies, you start talking about proficiencies, that's all included in graduation rates. I don't know whether that definition of those 2 components is really there. Oh yeah, graduation, yeah, kids graduate. Well, what's that mean? It's not just that they just graduated in a willy-nilly kind of a thing. It means that they have met the standards of the proficiency and competencies that each school district has set. So my concern is when we talk about graduation rates, that those concepts are embedded in that term, graduation rates. And I think it's important because when you begin thinking about it, you say, well, it's the old school conversation. Well, it's not the old school conversation because that old school conversation has changed over the last several years as we move to competency-based and proficiency-based standards. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I just don't want that to get lost of what it means to have a graduation rate. It's not old school. It's not willy-nilly. It's a standard that has been created by the local school district that each student has to meet before they can get the diploma.
Yeah, and Mel, so in the accountability and data needs section that's also in process right now, there is a discussion of the disconnect right now between old school language, like what we see in front of us, attendance rates, graduation rates, and scores, and competency-based language that's now in the statutes, and setting proficiency around competency-based learning in which every local district gets to define what proficiency is based on a competency-based approach. And then there's a huge challenge about comparing districts to each other and setting targets, statewide average targets, and therefore a funding formula linked to statewide average targets that are based on potentially highly diverse local definitions of proficiency on competency-based learning. So that has emerged as a policy challenge that we've identified in the report elsewhere that the next legislature is going to have to struggle with, and the department is going to have to struggle with.
Okay. I just didn't want that point to get lost.
No, but if you want to take a look at some of the wording, look at the last paragraph in page 2 and the top of page 3, where it grounds what we're not changing about the definitions of adequate education.
Right.
But it says that the content that schools are required to deliver is a locally determined curriculum. And if there's something, along your thought there, Mel, that's another sentence there to say the locally determined curricula can change and evolve as, resources and new learning modalities are available.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So Bruce, I'm sorry to follow up too. So did you say someone was looking at the wording we might put there, suggesting something about competency-based or not? Are we not going to?
Not in this section, Barbara.
Okay.
We take, there's a separate section in the report, and you have some drafts of that there.
Right.
About accountability and data, and that's where we raised this question of how do we hold districts accountable? How do we compare districts in an accountability sense? If we move away from some of the standardized outcome measures, and it is a real paradox, because we know in 21st century education is based on proficiency and competency.
You got it.
Yeah. But we fall back on standardized
exactly.
Measures,
it just needs to be a little bit more somewhere in the report. That's all. And listening to and being part of the conversation yesterday, I thought about it last night after my other meetings, and it just needs to be addressed. We need to get it out there. And I'm glad you're working on that. A little bit more needs to be in there. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So,
yeah, good.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Jay.
No, just for Monday, then another one of our assignments is to review that chapter too, right, Bruce?
Oh, yes. And that'll be going out with everything else. I happen to know that Chris Dwyer, as we speak, is working on that accountability section. And so that's, as I say, that's in process. other people have it, and any other comments, I'd be glad to take.
Great.
All right, Dave, you-
Jordan, thanks for popping this. Is this the highlighted one that I sent you?
I think, Bruce, you just put this up here. If you want, I can put the highlighted version that Dave sent me up on the screen.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I just used a little blue highlighter to highlight what I thought were things that maybe people hadn't seen before, although most of this document, a lot of this stuff's familiar, but it's been sort of laid out differently, so it now reads, I think, better. And I'll just walk through it really quick. And towards the end we get to the Mass 70 New Hampshire context example that Dick and Bill put together. And when we do that, I just sort of turn it over to them to walk us through that real quickly. But basically, and Jordan, if you just want to sort of scroll it as I'm talking here, introduction, background, what have we learned? None of this stuff is new. This is actually the stuff that Jay was talking about. What's New Hampshire's average per pupil cost? We show it in the context of regional assessment. This is a few years old in the U.S. Census, but then if we scroll up some more, you know, we can see where New Hampshire lies across all 50 states, and then there was a table. I think Bill may have developed this table. I don't know what the A, B, C, D, stuff is across the top. But
I can provide that the underlying table to Jordan, and he can cut and paste as he would choose.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, that would be great. But this is sort of a nice condensed way of seeing where New Hampshire is when it comes to per pupil spending, overall, the Ed Week ranking, state budget share, stuff like that. So
yeah, and I'll note that the census data is a little older because it takes them time to put together comparable education data across states. The accounting is kind of nuts, so that's why it's a couple years
right. It was, and Jordan, you're so right. The reason I chose it, it was the only apples to apples, the latest available apples to apples.
Yeah. But for comparison purposes, it's enough. These are a couple things I think we lifted out of the AIR report. Not working for large segments of students and taxpayers, inequities manifest themselves in outcomes. A couple of key findings there. And then we've got some findings that I think we've all seen before. None of this is earth-shattering. I highlighted the last two just to make sure that people are good. I mean, these are, I think, the critical findings that come out of AIR's analysis of where New Hampshire is now.
Dave, on that, can I just ask, how as you think about it, since you drafted these, how are you reconciling the statement that New Hampshire is among the highest quality on average public education systems in the country, with the highest spending, again, in the top 10 in the country, with the finding that New Hampshire's current system of funding is not working for large segments of New Hampshire students and taxpayers? So just talk me through how you
I reconcile that by taking one look at the Z-score chart. And when I see one town performing 2 orders of magnitude, two standard deviations above state average, and I see our largest school district in the state performing on average almost 2 standard deviations below state average, and I see a school district that's 15 minutes up I-89 from where I'm sitting right now, performing even a little bit lower than that. That's how I reconcile that. And so this is part of the the overused phrase, averages don't tell the whole story. On average, New Hampshire looks great, and I think that's why on average the ECM model would work very well. But that's not where it is right now, and that's how And it's not there for student equity across the state, and it's not there for.
I agree with that.
for
I agree.
taxpayers.
It's definitely not there for student equity.
Yeah. Yep.
Dave,
Yeah,
also,
John. I can hear you, John.
Moving on from the student outcome component, the tax policy component results in taxpayers in certain towns paying lower effective property tax rates to the state than other towns.
We're going to get to that.
But I guess that is also a component of the current system not working for taxpayers.
Yep. Yep.
Got it.
Great. Thanks. So let's keep moving through this, because I definitely want to get, I want to highlight the things so that we can all read these things leading up to Monday. So this blue highlight here is really important, and it may be, I think we may have seen it in a couple of earlier versions of the fiscal policy report, but this is basically saying that the language in the Londonderry case is being somewhat critical it is being critical of that, and it's saying that language should not allow for a singular consideration of who pays to stand in the way of consideration of student equity and fiscal neutrality. So it's not making a statement on first last dollar, but it's also saying that first last dollar doesn't necessarily lead to student equity and fiscal neutrality. So we're suggesting in this that an examination should consider who pays, but should also consider other factors as well.
Yeah.
Dick, you wrote this, so.
Who's there? Somebody else?
Dick, you're on.
I'm okay. I'm on. I think Dave, you started out by saying this might be a bit critical of the court's opinion. I don't really see it that way, and I think the word context in this sentence is important. So every court decision has a context to it. This one and the whole line of decisions that are on school funding in New Hampshire are issued in the context of a system that's heavily dependent on local property taxes, and that's true today as well as in the past, that are not equalized in any sense. They're not the disparities that result from that heavy dependence on local property taxes are not countered in any significant way by state intervention, state funds. So that's the reality that the state, the courts, the judiciary was working within. And in that reality, they said none of that financial obligation can be shifted to local school districts. And they said, regardless of their relative wealth or need, they didn't approve of a system that shifted to the local property tax with all its the variance that's associated with that. And so I think the point here is, and then they said in that context, okay, well, the option is the state needs to pay for everything. We're trying to shed new light on that and say, hey, we can have local property tax involvement. Our job is to include that in a way that ensures that in every situation, our goal of student equity is met, and we can do that. So it's not really critical. It's contextual and saying we're going to try to construct a funding system that that meets that sort of bottom line concern of the court, which is equity. So that's sort of the way I view it.
Thanks for laying it out that way, Dick. That definitely helps. I'm sorry I indicated otherwise. So
I wanted to add to that.
yeah, go ahead, Iris, please.
Hi, sorry I was late in joining you. Yeah, I don't see that statement as disavowing first to last dollar either. I see it as saying that it's possible to do all of it.
Great.
And just so to support, the way I read it is I'm trying to show the graph.
It doesn't work very well.
No, use your arms, Bill.
You know that graph.
Yeah, we know that graph.
All right.
New Hampshire is regressive. Massachusetts is progressive. If what a program does is get New Hampshire's student equity in balance and progressive, like AIR's report showed, we are achieving the fundamental purpose of the Claremont litigation. And that's the principal goal, is to fix that.
Right.
So that kids in Claremont have a shot at a good education compared to other kids. And to me, that's how I read that, is it's just saying the top line goal is student equity.
Great.
If you fix it, you win.
Yeah, and that's what this report emphasizes, that good fiscal policy and school funding is centered on student equity. And in a little bit, we're going to show 3 different fiscal policy models, each very different ways of doing of funding public education. They're just shown as examples, but most importantly, all 3 are a significant improvement in student equity. So it shows where that becomes important, and that's one of the things we'll talk about when we get to those. So Jordan, we'll keep going here. One of the things Jordan and I are working on is, if we're going to be putting links in line here, we got to make sure that these links are up forever. Otherwise, we need to put data somewhere else. So just some sort of technical stuff on that.
Can I, Dave, one thing that jumped out at me just below the section we were just talking about.
Okay.
That could be moved to that. So in the first sentence of the next paragraph, in the current statute, the state of New Hampshire significantly underestimates the cost of an adequate education. That really is a legal conclusion. And I wanted to say, I think, are you really saying that the input cost that's identified in the statute is not do you want?
No,
you know,
that's fair. And maybe what we should say is the cost of
not
education
the level
or something.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
You consider it, and then.
Yeah. No, I mean, the cost of an adequate education is calculated by a formula, which is in statute. So that it is what it is, but it's not what the cost of education is.
Right. I think that's something addressed like that. I wouldn't. We don't need to offer a legal.
No. Thanks for that.
Yeah, be careful how closely you tie this definition to a statute. It isn't. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm just trying to sort of summary review on this.
Point us in the right direction.
All right, let's scroll up.
It's a good paragraph.
I'm glad you like it. Let's see, this is just a lot of this stuff in yellow are things that are going to have to be broken out in.
Oh, wait a minute. I saw it there. Stop there. The second to last paragraph, the state's current estimated cost is not reproducible by any evidence-based approach. I agree with that. You've said it twice. There's somewhere else you've got it. Exactly.
All right, we'll have to search on that.
So
Make
maybe
sure we
your
only say it once.
fantastic editors will find that. It's the same page. Yeah, up above that, about 3-4 paragraphs back.
It's where we were.
Go back one more. Here we are. Let's see, the commission heard
Yep,
testimony.
there you go. Yep,
You got it? Yeah.
yep. Great, thanks.
No.
So this
That'll be
document.
my contribution for the day.
Thanks, Dick. No, yours is coming up. This document's already pushing 30 pages. So, all right, let's keep rolling through this. So in recommendations, one of the recommendations, and we've talked a lot about this, that we should eliminate the excess swept grant, and so that I mean we talk about it in a little bit more specificity. I think we've used the terms that John helped us talk about with no sort of, blanket rebates, abatements, discounts, on a municipal basis, that type of thing. And we do talk about robust, meaningful property tax relief and deferral programs later when we get into the fiscal policy model section.
Dave, one thing that jumped out with me in the blue section is that you'd probably want to qualify it at the beginning, say, to the extent the state property tax is used in a school finance system, comma, the state should eliminate. Because I think, it's not, I don't think the commission did get engaged with recommending one source over another.
That's a good point, Bill.
So
what do you mean one source over another?
Like revenue sources, we didn't really.
No, I think this is simpler than that. I think what this is saying is because we talk about this is the end of the section on what we're doing now.
Oh.
And what we're doing now is the state raises state revenues from a bunch of non-state property tax sources. So BET, BPT, rooms and meals, lottery, liquor, stuff like that. It raises revenues through state property tax sources. All of that, even though the state property tax is collected locally and maintained locally, that's not how it's reflected on the books. It's reflected on the books as being deposited by the treasurer into the education trust fund. And so this is laid out in the CAFR, and it showed as being distributed as grants based on adequacy with stabilization, and then this extra grant with excess swept that goes to specific towns. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we're eliminating that supplemental excess swept grant that comes from the state, at least on the books, and that it be directed to improve student and taxpayer equity instead.
Okay, I'm not following it, but I'll mark it up.
But yeah, no, I know you will. And there's stuff above it that I think, explains it. But let's mark it up.
The first paragraph recommendation is, are you saying anything about how much the state should increase the amount of state funds?
We're not, and we're not anywhere in here. But and that's a good point. Maybe this should be reflected that an increase in state share can improve student and taxpayer equity.
That would be true.
Well, that would be more consistent.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about.
Would that follow?
Yeah.
Does that statement follow the second one?
No, it's the one on top, right?
Yeah, the one on top.
I know. No, I get it. But in my order of thinking, I see this second one as being like a first step and then,
Oh, I see what you mean. Flip them.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's fine.
and
And
then you
Dave, you know, to
revise
some
it,
extent,
I think.
my comment about that first one is trying to avoid misleading readers of the report who might be looking, you know, I think I understand what you're saying now, but I don't want someone to say, you know, that the commission recommended.
Yeah.
state budget.
Yeah. And no, I'm on board with that. I mean, you know, so Jordan, let's change that comment though to so it's not avoid misleading report. That's not what the intention was. But an increase rather than the state should. Well, it really turns it into a finding instead. Maybe we move it into the findings. An increase in state funding can lead to increased.
Yeah, I think that's good, Dave.
I agree.
But Bill's suggestion was to the extent to which the state can increase funds for education, they should be directed towards student and taxpayer equity. That's a recommendation.
I didn't mean that, but I think that's a good idea to consider.
Yeah.
I was putting to the extent in front of the swept.
Okay, then why don't we do that? We'll make sure we've got a finding, and then we'll reword, we'll reorder these two recommendations, and that to the extent the state applies an increase in funding, that it direct it to improve student equity.
That's good, Jay.
Student equity and taxpayer equity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the conclusion of the section on where we are currently. The next section is basically taxation. And what do we talk? Well, you can read. Let's get to some blue stuff. You know, this talks about where we are right now. Talks about where taxes come from. Talks about the property tax and the stability of the property tax, even during periods of economic volatility. That's something we learned. That's just a reference that needs to be borne out. So we keep going up. So we got some blue stuff down here. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about this, but up until recently. But the Education Trust Fund is an important feature, I think, in state fiscal policy, and so we're making a statement here that it's a vehicle to collect deposits from a variety of revenue sources, and to have the funds available for the state treasurer to make timely payments to school districts. And you know, we certainly know from our own personal finances, but state finances, we see it, just town finances, we see it, that deposits come in and payments go out, but they don't necessarily come in and go out at the same time. So having something that can serve as a collection point for that is important. And particularly when there may be volatility in revenue sources, that having having something that maybe averages out over time has some value, because one of the things more than anything else that school districts need, in fact they need it more than money. Well, of course they need money, but is predictability, reliability, and predictability. So I think the ETF does help to reduce the risks associated with availability of state funds. Anyway, that's that point.
David, is there something in here that says the Education Trust Fund reassures the public that funds dedicated to education actually go there?
I think there's a strong concept for that, with the exception that since in all years preceding, I think FY 18 or 19, the ETF was drained at the end of the fiscal year and dumped into the general fund. So that's not always true. But I think I think that does provide some public assurance that money marked for education is used for education. And one of the recommendations that we've got later is that the state should discontinue draining the ETF into the general fund.
So on that point, and I know John Beardmore is on and he knows more about this. To the extent that Jay's point, which is it's a public policy recommendation that having a separate fund provides some clarity and understanding and public education purpose, I'm okay with that statement. To the extent as a matter of budget policy, I don't think this is an accurate statement. Other states like Massachusetts don't have separate education trust funds. And the reason is it's confusing. It's confusing to rating agencies. They wonder about the relationships, Dave, that you're talking about with the fact is money flows both ways, from the general fund in and from the education trust fund out. And it's very confusing to a budget kind of policy person, a budget and accounting thing. So I just want to make sure that I get that point on the table. I don't think it's essential from a matter of technical budget policy. I think it's costly and inefficient, and it's confusing to track, to split, for example, the BET revenues into two pieces, and the BPT and the increase in the meals and rooms tax. That's very confusing, and it's hard to do your revenue estimates and things like that, taking that into account. And what you do is you just combine them both, general and education trust fund, like in the surplus statement.
Then you break them apart.
But I'm okay with, if you want to keep a fund that somehow is easier for the public to track, fine.
Okay, so maybe we'll put some of that into the findings. We'll adjust these a little bit, but definitely send put them in your comments.
I will.
That we can all work from next week while final drafting is is being done. So
I would just concur with what Bill just said. I don't personally think the Education Trust Fund serves any useful purpose. But I also don't think it's detrimental to leave it in place.
Right.
And I think we'd be better off just sidestepping that conversation altogether, because we've got plenty of other things to argue about. And I don't think it's really impactful one way or the other on the bigger picture things that we're looking at.
okay.
I agree with that. I hadn't seen anything about education trust fund budget policy before this.
But I think Mel ought to react to this a little, Mel Carey, because I think when people were asked, source of funds, would you pay more to so that all kids could have a more equal education? I think that they've heard that if we know that it's actually going to go to education, then okay. I mean, people are looking for some guardrails, I think.
Like lottery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But lottery went to education before the Education Trust Fund existed.
Education trust fund doesn't do that.
It's probably more perception than it is reality.
But that's a true statement.
That is.
All right, we'll try to come up with some language, and if it doesn't work, we'll zap it out of there. So, all right, let's keep moving. Okay, there's a little more ETF here. We talked about draining the ETF. And now we're getting into, and are these recommendations? Yes. Yeah. Yep. So, I think,
David, I'm not sure the education trust fund gets drained into the general fund, though.
It
It
has
usually goes the other way.
for every year through FY, including FY17.
Money is taken out of the education trust to go back into the general fund?
Yep.
I believe
Yep.
statutorily it does not drain. My
Really?
recollection is that in House Bill 2, successive legislatures have written chapter law that accesses excesses in the education trust fund for the benefit of the general fund to make their budget work.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. And
So, but I think the point is, as it exists in statute, it is supposed to accumulate a surplus.
right,
The
right,
legislature has not allowed it to do so.
right. And so it actually did accumulate a surplus from FY18 through FY22.
Yeah.
But in at least the prior 8 years in the CAFR that I was looking at, you could see the withdrawals on the transfer of funds on 6/30 or whenever that happened. So
But that's one of the reasons why in our budget this year, the budget we just passed, we moved CAT aid and building aid and everything into it. Previously was in the general fund, and we moved it into the education trust.
Yeah.
Just for that reason.
right, and because it had the surplus, and it had the surplus that provided the
Right.
the funds for the fiscal disparity, the supplemental aid that went in the FY21 budget. All right. And we've got some discussion about state property tax here. Should be collected by the municipal tax collector or remitted in full to the DRA for subsequent deposit to the education trust fund by the state treasurer. There should be no blanket rebates, abatements, refunds, or grants of SBT back to municipalities. And the legislature should consider non-SBT revenue sources to reduce pressure on property tax, evaluate state revenue sources using criteria defined in the 2000 Commission report, and hold public hearings and solicit public input if new revenue sources are to be considered. It's just not, I think it's just stating what we're not doing in this Commission report.
Dave?
Yeah.
Since you're talking about statewide property tax, could you go back to just scroll up a little bit to where you define SPT as a state tax?
Yeah.
I think it would be worth putting in that it is a state property tax from local community property tax payers, so that the reader understands that the SPT is drawn from local property taxpayers. So I would clarify that so it doesn't appear like it's a state tax that's collected by what or from where. But I think if it specifies that it's a state property tax or a state tax from local community property taxpayers, then it might make them rethink, well, all right, we already are collecting taxes from the local communities. Do we want to add another one? So just didn't know if you thought that should be more of a descriptor for what the state tax is.
Yeah, and I think that describes
And we've talked about the issue that it is the individual taxpayer. It is not a collective community. It's not a collective community that's collecting the tax, but
Right.
it's from each taxpayer. And I think that's a
Right.
good clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, let's keep going. I know we're going to run over our 2 hours a little bit. Let's just keep going so that we can sort of see what the rest of this document looks like, and then we're at home with it over the weekend. So. Oh, did we get into? Oh, here we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're here at the examples.
Yeah. So sorry, Jordan. I wanted to. So now we're in the section of fiscal policy, And the idea here is, and I think we say right up front, principle of student equity needs to be central to the framing of fiscal policy. So that's the most important thing. And we're essentially laying out that there's different ways that you can approach this problem and still improve student equity. So we're really sort of laying these out as examples. The first two examples, and we'll need to do, I know we need to do more work on the description of these things, is to talk about how in example one, we improve student equity and taxpayer equity. How in example two, we improve student equity and taxpayer equity. I mean, I think we need to show these things. And then example three, in example three, which is it's basically the Massachusetts model in the New Hampshire context. Bill and Dick worked on it, and we also need to, I think we need to add a little bit more to it that talks about how it improves student equity, how it improves taxpayer equity. But can I just turn it over to Dick to sort of walk us through what we've got here, because it's pretty comprehensive. Dick Ames, are you there? Yeah, he's there. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, sorry, Dick. Yeah.
Yeah, I turned it off when the telephone rang. I think just highlighting what's here is what's important. We've tried to, well, early on in this work with the commission, we got onto the information that Massachusetts had an interesting way of raising and including local revenues in its foundation budget. And they called it this a mandatory minimum local contribution. And that found a place in the AIR's report early on. I think maybe even before, certainly most people in the commission, and maybe everybody really fully understood what that was. But it's there in the model that AIR has done for us, and they've laid out two of the possibilities that are examples that we have here. One is a total state funding option with the SPT. And so 100% state funding is there in the model. If you want to turn it on, you can turn off the minimum local contribution and go to the full thing. And there it is, including, I think they've got, they show the excess revenues. I can't remember. I think they do. And it produces a lot of state property tax revenues that in effect are used to fund the program throughout the state. So it's always been there. And as we dug into it, I know I became quite interested in it as a way maybe of getting into that context that we talked about earlier, that our Supreme Court has worked within as it's issued its rulings. And what you have here is a layout of the legal history of the two states, which have sort of followed a parallel but quite different course. Actually, I was in Massachusetts as general counsel of the Executive Office of Educational Affairs in, I think it was 1977, when the first school funding case was filed. It was called Webby v. Dukakis. And it became, I think, McDuffie later on. And here in New Hampshire, Claremont came along, and they both, went down. And in both cases, the courts were looking at the same, essentially the same language in the court about cherishing the educational needs of children. And in both cases, the courts came to the conclusion that there was a duty, a state duty to meet that, to provide for that commitment, that duty, a duty to fund and provide for every child's need for an adequate education, what we call an adequate education, but in Massachusetts, they didn't call it that, they just called it an education. And then the litigation sort of parted ways, and in Massachusetts, almost we
Oh, you muted yourself, Dick.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I do know how it happened. So in Massachusetts, just as McDuffie came out, a legislative effort came to fruition, and the so-called Chapter 70 formula was put on the table and enacted, and that essentially met the concerns of the court. It was reviewed by the court later on, and it was found to be sufficient. The Superior Court, the trial court, thought it violated the constitutional duty of the state, but the Supreme Court, Judicial Court, said otherwise. So, so their system reached closure. Our system is still ripe for litigation, and there is ongoing litigation, as we know. It's in the Supreme Court right now. And so in Massachusetts, what they did was they took this duty to provide an education to every child that met constitutional requirements that were stated in broad brush, and funded it with state money plus local money. It's essentially, the federal money was there, but that was to the side. And the local money was to be provided through this minimum local contribution formula that essentially equalized the input from localities across the state using a uniform rate to based on property value and on income, and that would produce statewide the revenues needed to meet what they called their foundation budget, along with an amount of state funding. So they parceled out each community's obligation to contribute to that foundation budget by looking at each community's property value and income. And that produced essentially an equal effort across the state, but it had this one inequity in it that couldn't be avoided. And that is, when you get to the wealthiest districts, they don't really have to raise as much as every other district. If you think about it as like our state property tax, the rate falls off for those wealthiest districts. And so what I've worked on, and Bill has worked on with me, is trying to translate how that would work in New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, our sense is we don't have income data, but we do have good property value data. And that we could construct a minimum local contribution that would be very much like our statewide property tax. In fact, exactly like our statewide property tax as it functions today, because there's no collection of excess, but that would operate in conjunction with a state funding system that would send money in behind what was raised locally to bring it up to a value that provided, in our terminology, an adequate education. And so that's what all this language is about. There's a summary of it. That's, I don't know what page it is, towards the end of what you have there. I think it's, I don't have page numbers in my printout. Where do you have our summary? Towards the end of what we have on Massachusetts.
Is Jordan, is Jordan?
Driving, what?
There it is. There we go.
You were here? Okay.
A little further. A little further. There's Bill's charts. Okay. Some commission members up above. There you go. You had it a moment ago. There. So this summarizes what we've talked about. We say here what I said earlier this afternoon. I almost said this evening. The court has never examined a system like the Chapter 70 program, which requires communities to exercise their local property tax power to raise a strict minimum local contribution that is designed by the state to vary inversely with local community wealth, and that must be devoted to meeting the foundation budget, call it adequacy, spending requirement, all of which operate together in a highly integrated manner with state aid to achieve the much more progressive result shown in the two graphs above. There's Bill's two graphs. And there's a substantial difference between oops, you just took me out. No, there we go. There's a substantial difference between a public school system that does not substantially focus aid on the most needy districts and relies heavily on an unrestrained and unguided exercise of local property tax power, as faced the Claremont 2 court, what I said about context, and a public school system, on the other hand, a public school system whose guiding principle is to provide greater state budget resources to districts with greater need and requires wealthier districts to have a greater local contribution as part of achieving that progressive distribution goal. So that's what this is all about. Actually, the numbers are laid out in the ECM for a $5 minimum local contribution. And so you can see how it plays out. It seems like a decent model, and to have a very decent chance of succeeding within the framework that our Supreme Court has worked with until now. And it's just another way that we would be pointing to in this report by which the state's obligation could potentially be met.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Iris. Yeah.
Thanks. Right after the section that you were reading, it says the commission recommends that consideration be given to the Massachusetts experience with the chapter. It sounds like a recommendation, whereas each of the other two examples that were laid out, the ones from the air report, don't have that kind of statement. Are you recommending this third example, or are you remaining neutral among the three? It's not.
I think we should remain. No, Iris, that's a good. This was dropped in. I think we should remain neutral on all three.
Well, this is not a neutral.
No, I understand.
I think there's agreement on that, Iris. That's
agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It's the first time I'm seeing any of this, so I'm just reacting.
You're right.
Yeah. Okay.
You're really quick on the ball there. You got one.
Yeah. The other things that I took a couple notes on mine. So the Massachusetts Foundation budget, I think, is about 65% of what Massachusetts currently spends on public education. And I was wondering, given that, how does the student, like we really haven't really talked about student equity, but how does it work for those districts, particularly the ones that have lower fiscal capacity in terms of getting to whatever they should be spending on public, their spending on their schools?
You mean, you're asking how's the performance been? How?
Well, it's, I don't know if we have that data, but if, if we started with the premise that it costs more to educate 1,000 kids in Lowell than it does 1,000 kids in Wellesley, and we know that the Math 70 program in Wellesley, is basically 65-ish% of whatever state average cost is. What's Wellesley doing above that? And in Lowell, if it's around 65% of what state average cost, what's Lowell doing above that?
I can bet that Lowell's doing less than Wellesley. I mean, what's done above the line is always going to skew to the wealthier districts.
Right. But I think that's where a question of student equity, comes into play.
But that's true of whatever system we construct, unless
Yep.
we're going to cut off that ability of high wealth districts to go higher. It's always going to skew higher. I mean, I remember saying that very early on in our discussion, and we can't pretend otherwise.
Mhm.
When we're done with this and we've got let's say we got really good numbers and the legislature adopts them, there's still going to be inequity. It's inevitable given the uneven wealth in the state, as long as you allow for it. And this, none of us are going to say that we shouldn't allow for that.
Right. But I guess, in being able to evaluate the three examples, we're saying that student equity is the number one factor. I think we should have some way of evaluating how in the three examples student equity is I guess.
I think Bill wants to talk about his charts.
Yeah.
If you go up, Jordan, I think Dave's answer is earlier in the description of the Chapter 70 program. Keep going up further to keep a little bit more. It talks about keep a little more. Let's see where it is. There's two graphs. Oh boy, let's see, where are the graphs? Nope, it's further down. And it's below that chart. Right. So Dave,
yeah,
just like ECM, so wait, slow, Jordan. We want to get that upper graph in there too. Not that graph yet. Yeah. No. Sorry, no. It's the one above paragraph 3. So you
the
see
horizontal graph.
The horizontal bars.
Okay.
There you go.
Horizontal bars.
Just like ECM predicts higher costs for Manchester than for other districts. This is a graph that came out that Mass DOE puts out that shows that based on economic disadvantage, if you're in the most disadvantaged district, your foundation budget, which is the total target, is more per pupil than if you're not. And then if you go to the next graph down, this shows an example, and obviously I found this graph in working with Dick in the Mass DOE presentation. It shows that the total local contribution, which is the property tax contribution for communities who have the least capacity, like Lawrence and Fitchburg in this chart, that local contribution is lower, while the state aid payment to meet foundation budget. So there's in two ways they're implementing student equity. One way is in the foundation budget differs by district. The second is the way their system operates. The state budget aid is highly focused on the most needy districts. And the final graph I will show down, if you go
Before
down.
you go from that one,
Oh, yeah.
Bill, just another observation is as you look at Westwood
Yeah.
and Stoneham, Westwood in particular, is at, I think, 82.5%,
Exactly.
which is the cap. No wealthy district it gets cut off entirely from state aid under their system. And that's just a choice that Massachusetts has made. It's not a choice that's inherent to this system.
So
Go ahead.
yeah. So on the horizontal, the graph right above it where we started. So we're looking at foundation budget, but you know, it's essentially their estimated cost for communities that fall into these categories, from 10,000, almost $10,500 to, let's say, $13,600. And Massachusetts average spend is about, well, this is the U.S. Census 2018, but $17,000.
Correct.
So it's still, it's sort of like saying it's sort of like doing what we have with our ECM, but derating it by 35% or something like that.
Exactly right.
And then so the 35% more that Manchester needs and the 35% more that Wolfboro or that Hanover needs, Hanover's going to have to raise that 35% more, and Pittsfield's also going to have to raise that 35% more to get there.
Well, except that these are deciles, I guess, this graph that they have. And I didn't recreate the DOE number. There are communities like New Bedford, right, where the foundation budget is 14,000. And they end up spending just a teeny bit more than 14,000. So they spend at foundation budget. The Mass law does not prohibit a community from raising more money through exercise of local property tax power. So that, but clearly Wellesley gets $1,700 per pupil compared to New Bedford, which would be in that last percentile, that they get for almost $14,000 of state
Most
aid.
of it, yeah.
And the bottom line, in terms of the measurement of student equity, if Jordan, if you would just let me nudge you to scroll down to what Dick is teasing me now about my graphs, but I am focused on it.
They're good graphs, Bill. They're good graphs.
Those graphs, how do you know that Massachusetts has achieved student equity? If you can get this graph, you've done it. Whereas, how do you know that New Hampshire is deficient? That graph shows that our system is deficient. If it, to me, Dave, and this is one of the things, if a legislator were to ask, so what do we have to achieve in order to successfully achieve student equity? I think the answer is you have to bend New Hampshire's curve to get more like Massachusetts. To me, that is the simplest way to visually explain what we have to do to achieve student equity. And the Mass system clearly does that. And that's why the court in Mass and Hancock said, legislature, you're moving in the right direction. You have achieved a progressivity result that is responsive to the McDuffie litigation.
So all right. Well, now let me. All right. We just looked at that horizontal chart, and Wellesley's foundation budget is somewhere like, I don't know, what was it, like $12,000 or something like that.
A little lower. They're like
11,000, and New Bedford's was, what'd you say, 14 or 15,000.
Yeah.
And the Massachusetts average spend is 17,000. and I'm guessing Wellesley is going to go way above that. So they're going to raise the difference between 11,000 and whatever they're spending. And New Bedford is probably not going to spend that much or have the capacity to raise that much beyond foundation. You know, using those examples, those two examples would not be consistent with this chart.
Well, I think that I think that's probably right. The bottom line is, this is the graph that AIR produced.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, and there is the data, I only cut and pasted just the New Hampshire and Mass. So you have to look at it in that exhibit. But to me, one thing is clear. Massachusetts law does not say to districts, you don't have any power to raise local taxes to spend on public education. They just build in a foundation system that covers the bulk, the majority of the system. New Hampshire has to decide what kind of system it puts in place.
So Bill, going back to Alice's, you know, when she met with the commission, she talked about how Massachusetts was on a 7-year plan. Yeah. And in the first year, it was, you know, to cover, I forget, 38, 39%, something like that. And they're marching towards something higher. And it sounded like to get there over 7 years, it would be gradual increases in the foundation budget, or 1/7 each year. I mean, she talked about that. Is this Massachusetts graph after 7 years, or is this the first year?
No, this is old data. I mean, this is historic, isn't it?
Yes.
No, I'm talking about the Massachusetts, the one we're looking at right now.
That's
data. That's historical data.
It's from 1718. What?
Really?
Yeah, that's what it says in our,
you know, this,
in the
Dave,
AIR report.
This shouldn't be surprising,
Okay.
Dave. This
Okay.
is not surprising. If what New Hampshire is doing now, the bulk of its state aid goes out on a, you know, a per pupil fixed uniform basis, because we know the differentiated aid amounts have gotten very low. And so, you know, I'm not surprised New Hampshire produces that result. Its state aid is not as targeted in any stretch of the imagination as Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that. I'm not.
And in
I'm
Boston
not,
too.
I'm not advocating for New Hampshire's current model, but
no. And another important thing is the big city problem. We saw the big bubble of Manchester. Well, they've got the big bubble in Mass. Dick is general counsel of Boston, and their Boston has a very high foundation budget and very high aid. And I think moving the bubble of, just like in our data, if we moved the bubble of Manchester, we would have a significant impact on that New Hampshire regressivity. They've already done that with Boston, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other thing to note is that this is a moving target. Massachusetts has last year put in place an adjusted formula, and that formula reflects dissatisfaction with the progressivity of their weighting. They've as I understand it, increased significantly the weights for the economically disadvantaged kids. So 2 or 3 years from now, assuming that, you know, they go forward, this line should tilt even further up.
Depending on local contribution.
Okay, so there's a lot here, and I think Bruce sent this and the adequacy report out to everybody. Jordan, if you scroll down some more, I'll just sort of wrap through the rest. I don't think I had anything else blue lined. But we talk about circuit breakers, we talk about data collection. We've got findings in the fiscal policy section. We've got some implementation considerations, and I think we've got to blend these a little bit more with I know Jay's got some in adequacy, so we need to talk blend those a little bit more. And then we've got a quality plan section that basically talks about ways where you can evaluate a fiscal policy model on the basis of student equity. Let's go, I think it's student equity, fiscal neutrality, and taxpayer equity. And the taxpayer equity one is interesting because it basically relies on DRA tax rate data, and you can look at the highs and lows of tax rates and the standard deviations and stuff like that. And you know, what we should see as you know, when implementing a an equity-based system, whether it's student equity and or taxpayer equity, you're going to see those curves. And Jay, you know, did this I think this morning. You're going to see those curves go from sort of like a flat bell curve to you know, to a tighter curve. You're going to see it in performance. You're going to see it in tax rates too. So so that's what it talks about there. And I think that probably brings us to pretty close to the end of the, what page we on here? Oh yeah, and then we just got the calendar.
So the pagination on this, for the ease of Monday, I think throwing page numbers on these would be good.
Yeah.
Well, what you'll see is a single integrated document with, you know, fully paginated with a table of contents on the top. And I think that Carrie and I will be able to, over the weekend, make that table of contents active. So you can click on any heading up in the table of contents and immediately get to the section that you're interested in. But our goal is to create a single integrated, coherent, well, coherent maybe a high bar, but document for Monday. Recognizing again that what you'll see Monday is a draft. It's not final format. Once we affirm the contents in our conversation on Monday, then we'll take the next week prior to our final meeting on the 30th to create standard format throughout the document.
Will we get this before Monday?
Yes, yeah. I guess RSU, before you got on, our goal, my goal, and Carrie's and Jordan are going to help me, is to create that single integrated final draft tomorrow, Saturday, and get it to you either sometime on Saturday or certainly by Sunday morning. I recognize that we all like longer than that, but that's where we are.
Is it our plan to have an executive summary?
Yeah, we have an executive summary placeholder in the, and that will really extract, we'll write that like any sort of research paper, you write the abstract at the end and you pull out key findings, recommendations, description of the commission and its charge at the very end, pulling directly from existing sections of the document.
Yeah.
So,
And
I don't promise that we'll have that for you on Monday.
No.
But we will have a summary. We'll have a section again in the document that pulls together all of the findings and recommendations that you've seen from engagement, adequacy, and fiscal policy. In addition to leaving each of these sections intact that we've been going through today.
And at this point, you all have the majority of the sections to review for Monday. It'll just be on the one you receive will have some of the edits that have been discussed. And it'll be all in one document.
Great. So that's the plan for Monday. I think the other item on Monday's agenda is going to be the contract extension with the Carsey School. Just spoiler alert, we have got thumbs up from University System Council, from Jim Cianci, General Court Counsel. Speaker's Office has said, Dave, makes a lot of sense, go forward with it. And we've got final drafting from the, actually, I haven't seen final because we wanted to push the date of the payments obviously into the term of the extension. So March 30th and June 30th. And I don't know if Diane's gotten back to me.
Yes, yeah, Dave, Diane, you have that now from Diane.
Oh, I do have it. Okay, great.
She sent you the final Exhibit B scope of work for signature. So that's
okay. Well, signature won't happen until we vote on it
of
on
course.
Monday. Yeah, yes, Iris.
I have a question going backwards about the draft that we're going to get by Sunday morning. When does the public see that? Do they only see it at the meeting Monday, or do they get a look at that in advance of Monday's meeting?
I mean, typically we post any documents that you get with an agenda for Monday's meeting and backup documents that gets posted once you all get it.
They'll see it when we see it. Okay, wondered.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. And I definitely appreciate the comments where there may be too much stuff in certain areas, particularly if we haven't received substantial testimony on it, because this report is certainly looking like it's got a lot of pages to it, and I'd rather during our review we consider a lot of things, but it shouldn't be a problem to take stuff out. So
we can always move some of the discussion into appendix if people want to go deeper into a particular topic. So we can, that'll make the body of the report itself a little bit more manageable if we decide to do that.
Well, as a first read, I will say it was a little strange that the three examples you threw out, from the air report about funding, the first two were very short, and then the mass thing was like 10 pages long. And I didn't know whether maybe there could be a concise statement about the mass approach that was more similar to the other two, and then the full description that you go into about it be an appendix.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Very out of kilter.
That's a good suggestion, Iris, and that struck me too. That I think we do need some more sort of neutral balance in that, and sort of talk about the three examples as, you do this, here are the parameters, and then here's how it works. And
makes good sense to me.
Yeah. So, all right, good. All right, we went longer than we thought, but
hard work. Hard work, yeah. Good work, you guys.
Yeah, amazing what you guys do.
Well, it's a team. It's been a team effort since day one, but I gotta say, Jordan and Carrie and Bruce have just been amazing on this, and a lot of it is writing stuff, anticipating how we might feel on things, but also to generate discussion on things too. So thanks all for that effort. All right, go out and enjoy the evening.
Thank you.
And enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you on
5 o'clock somewhere.
All right. All right. See you.